welcome to the Bideford Parsonage Museum, historical residence of Lucy Maud Montgomery during 1894-95. Come in, relax, and join us for Storytime with LM Montgomery.
Hi, my name is Donna Williams, and I'm reading to you a story today called A Lesson in Behaviour, and it was printed in the Philadelphia Times on August the 20th, 1899. And this is a little picture here of how it looked in the newspaper at that time. So the story is called A Lesson in Behaviour, and it's how a young girl met the governor's wife. Millicent Lewis was in a flutter of excitement, for Governor Carew was coming to Mannering to attend the big political convention, and his wife was coming with him. Now Mrs. Governor Carew was the fairy lady of all Millicent's daydreams. She had been her mother's friend in the days of her girlhood, and Millicent was named for her. Millicent had never seen Mrs. Carew, but she had heard a great deal about her from her mother, and now that she was coming to be her mother's guest, it is no wonder that Millicent was in a tingle of excitement over it all. She knew that Mrs. Carew was beautiful and clever and wealthy, and she was particularly anxious to make a good impression on her. Millicent Lewis was a very pretty girl, quite as pretty as ever a 16-year-old girl could be, with a slim, girlish figure, soft brown eyes, a peach blossom skin, and a sweet expression. She was clever and graceful and good-tempered. Everybody liked her, but she had some faults, of course. She looked like a picture or a poem, but she talked slang and was not in the least particular when or where she talked it. Her mother had often spoken to her about it, and the day before the big convention she said, "Millicent, I want you to break off this unladylike habit. You do not realize how it is growing on you. If Mrs. Carew hears you using slang, she will be terribly shocked, for she is particularly fastidious on this very point. Slang with her is the hallmark of all ill breeding." Millicent herself was fascinated at the idea, and she assured her mother that she would not use a single word of slang during Mrs. Carew's visit. "I'll just be as careful as possible, Mother. I suppose I do use a good deal of slang, but it hits off what I mean better than plain English does. However, I will really turn over a new leaf, Mother of mine. I don't want to get into Mrs. Governor Carew's black books. Mrs. Lewis laughed and then sighed half the time you really don't know that you are talking at Millicent. "Well, my dear, I have warned you. If Mrs. Carew finds that you fall short of her ideal of a young lady, she will never overlook it. In her last letter to me, she hinted something about having you visit her next winter, and if she is pleased with you, no doubt she will. But it all rests with you, Millicent." Millicent seriously reflected on her mother's warning and intended to act upon it. If she should fall below Mrs. Governor Carew's standard, nobody would feel worse than she would herself, but she felt pretty sure that she would not. Without being vain, she knew her own good points very well, and was determined that Mrs. Carew should not be ashamed of her namesake. The day of the convention came. The special train with the governor and all the other delegates was to arrive at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and a grand public meeting was to be held at once in the town hall. Mrs. Lewis remained at home to complete her preparations, and Mr. Lewis had gone to the station with the members of the reception committee, and Millicent was left to go to the convention in company with 3 of her schoolmates, all whom were quite as excited and quite as slangy as she was. Millicent was looking as radiant and as pretty as the most critical person could have wished. Her dress and hat were in perfect taste, all her appointments were neat and dainty, and her cheeks flushed and her eyes sparkling. They were rather late in reaching the hall, but found good seats, about halfway up the aisle, and into them they all fluttered with a good deal of rustling and giggling and whispering, and having settled themselves to their own satisfaction, proceeded to look about them. On the platform sat the speakers. Foremost among them, Millicent soon recognized the portly governor whose photograph she had seen. The front seats were filled with the ladies of the governor's party, but as Millicent could not see their faces, she could not decide which was Mrs. Carew, whose photograph she had also seen. She rather thought, however, that the tall, dark-haired lady with the stylish violet-trimmed bonnet and the Greek profile who sat in the far corner was she, and proceeded to tell her companions so, cutting into their indiscriminate chatter with her clear, penetrating whisper. "Who's Mrs. Governor Carew?" "You don't say so," whispered Mabel Drew. "They tell me she's a regular swell. Your mother knows her, doesn't she, Mill?" "Right you are," said Millicent proudly. "She and mother were awful chums when they were kids. Let me tell you, she's a peach in the beauty line. Who was that old frump getting up to speak?" "Oh, that's one of the big guns. Senator something or other. He's no beaut, is he?" Well, I should, remarked Millicent sweetly. "However, if he has something to say, let's give him a show." For a few minutes the girls were silent, and Millicent amused herself with scrutinizing the people in the seat before her. Directly in front of her, a quietly dressed woman was sitting. Her abundant hair was beautifully dressed, and presently Millicent nudged Mabel Drew to call her attention to it. "How does that style of hairdressing strike you? I think it is just too. "Not too dusty," whispered Mabel, and then they kept on whispering. Is there anybody in the world that has not been annoyed by people that chattered and fidgeted behind them in some public place? It is the most exasperating thing in the world. Yet Millicent Lewis, with all her sweet ways and her careful upbringing, was addicted to this very rudeness, and she and her companions amused themselves during the senator's dull speech by giggling and whispering freely. In vain were indignant glances cast at them from time to time by the victims in their immediate neighborhood. The girls were quite oblivious of them all. They did not realize how much of a disturbance they were creating. "Here are some chocolates," Millie whispered Josie Kane at the end of the seat. "Help yourself and pass them on." "Thanks awfully," said Millicent. "If there's anything I adore, it's chocolates. These are A1 too, Joe." "I wish Senator Yeaman would hurry up and finish," said Mabel. "Who's the next on the list?" "Mr. Sadler," said Millicent, "and he's a daisy. But I half wish I hadn't come after all. I had no idea it was going to be so slow. I'm half roasted too. Look at my beloved Patter up there tying himself into knots with the heat. Wouldn't it give you a fit?" With the conclusion of Senator Yeaman's speech and the opening of Mr. Sadler's came a globalized lull. Mr. Sadler could interest even frivolous schoolgirls. But when he sat down and another long-winded delegate took the platform, off went the restless tongues again. "Thank goodness there is only one more," said Mabel Drew, "and that is the governor himself. He and his wife are going to your ranch, aren't they, Mill?" "You bet," said Millicent's refined musical voice. And so it went on, buzz, giggle, nudge for 10 minutes more, and then the patience of one person in that audience suddenly gave way. The long-suffering lady in front of Millicent turned squarely around and dealt the latter, who was just in the midst of a whispered exhortation to Mabel Drew, a scornful, decided stare from a pair of very lovely dark grey eyes. Then she turned her head again and settled back into her place. Millicent had stopped whispering as suddenly as if she had been stricken dumb, and a wave of crimson crept up over her face to the very edge of her hair. She felt a sudden stinging realization that she had been guilty of very unladylike conduct, and as if everybody in the building had looked condemnation at her through those clear grey eyes. She could not remember ever having seen the lady before, yet there had seemed something curiously familiar in her clear-cut features. Even Mabel Drew had been silenced by that look, and there was an absolute silence in that seat for the rest of the meeting. When the convention adjourned, Millicent hurried out, and forgetting her recent snub in her reawakening excitement, hastened home and ran to her own room to make sure that her dress was in order for the expected visit of Mrs. Governor Carew. When her mother sent the maid to call her, she was quite ready, and she hurried down the stairs and into the parlour. As Millicent's entrance, the lady that was standing by Mrs. Lewis at the window slowly turned. A dash of surprised recognition seemed to cross her face. She was a tall, handsome woman with dark grey eyes and an abundance of richly dressed fair hair. Millicent found herself face to face at last with Mrs. Governor Carew, and also with the lady of the afternoon's adventure. Poor Millicent, crimson-faced and confused, she took Mrs. Carew's outstretched hand and stammered some inarticulate greeting while Mrs. Lewis stood by in amazement, wondering what could have come over her graceful and self-possessed daughter. At the earliest opportunity, Millicent made her escape and fled to her room, where her mother found her later on, crying as if her heart would break. "My dear child, what is the matter?" "Oh, mother," sobbed Millicent, "something dreadful. But I deserve it. I am rightfully punished. Oh, if I'd only remembered what you had said. But who would have thought that the governor's wife would be sitting way down there in the middle of the room?" And then out came the whole miserable confession. Mrs. Lewis listened with feelings of keen disappointment, but she knew that Millicent's punishment was already bitter enough. "I will not scold you, Milly," she said sorrowfully, "for I am sure you feel mortified enough now. I am very much grieved and hope that you may never forget this lesson." During the 3 days of Mrs. Carew's visit, no fault whatever could have been found with Millicent's speech or manner. She was her own sweet ladylike self, but the mischief had been done. Never in any way did Mrs. Carew refer to that unfortunate afternoon, but went away without any mention whatever of a next winter's visit. And Millicent realized that she would never quite regain her lost place in Mrs. Governor Carew's esteem. It was a grievous disappointment, but a wholesome lesson. Nowadays, not a single word of slang ever crosses Millicent Lewis's pretty lips, and you might search the audiences of the American continent over without finding in them a girl of more irreproachable demeanor. But a lost opportunity seldom returns, and Millicent has never recovered the place that she forfeited the afternoon she talked slang and whispered behind the quiet lady at the political convention in Mannering. Thank you.